Welcome back again to Last Week I Watched. I'm Mark and I watch and review movies and TV shows and try to give you an idea whether or not they're worth your time watching them or not, or whether or not you're interested in them. So this week I've been watching some horror films. So I want to talk about Dr. Terra's House of Horrors, Black Death, Terra Train, Inbred, Halloween Kills, and The Bone Snatcher. So let's talk about them. First up is Dr. Terra's House of Horrors. It's from 1965. It stars Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee and Donald Sutherland, and this was showing on Prime. So this is an anthology story. It's about 5 men. They enter a train carriage bound for Bradley, and they're joined on their journey by the mysterious Dr. Terra, who opens a pack of tarot cards during the journey and proceeds to reveal the destinies of each of the travellers. So this was a first in a series of anthology horror films from Amicus. They're a British studio that produces largely horror films, and there were 5 stories in this contained within sort of an overall wrapping story of the people on the train. The first story is Werewolf. It's about architect Jim Dawson. He's making renovations to an old family home when he finds a coffin behind a fake wall in the cellar. Local legend states that the Count, who dwelled there, would return to reclaim his home, and Jim witnesses him arising at night as a werewolf. When he fails to kill the werewolf, he discovers that it's all been an elaborate trap for revenge. The second story is Creeping Vine, where a family are menaced by a fast-growing vine in the yard that has become intelligent and harbours homicidal tendencies against anyone who threatens its existence. The third story is called Voodoo. It's about a jazz musician. He steals the tune from a local voodoo ceremony, and when he tries to use it in a jazz composition, there are dire consequences. The fourth story is Disembodied Hand, when pompous art critic Franklin Marsh, played by Christopher Lee, berates and criticises painter Eric Landor, played by Michael Gough. Landor humiliates him publicly. In revenge, Marsh runs over Landor with his car and causes the painter to lose his hand. Unable to paint anymore, he commits suicide, but his severed hand takes its revenge on Marsh. And the final story is Vampire. It's Dr. Carroll, played by Donald Sutherland. He returns to the US with his new French bride Nicole. Soon there is evidence that a vampire is on the loose, and Carroll seeks the aid of his colleague Dr. Blake to put a stop to it. Dr. Terra reveals the only way the men can escape their destinies is to die before they occur, but there's a final twist which you'll probably spot before the end, and I'm not going to spoil it here. The only issue with classic horror is what was considered scary or pushing the envelope then is quite different from what it is now. I do really enjoy anthologies though, especially if the story is clever and has a twist on it, sort of similar to The Twilight Zone. But I didn't find the stories particularly scary. It's pretty good to see some of the greats of horror together though, especially since many of them have gone now. And they had extensive careers, so it's kind of interesting to see, you know, some of the things of where they came from. The best stories on this one, I think, were Werewolf and Disembodied Hand. The others were probably a little more mild or humorous, but the actors do a good job playing the situations fairly seriously. If you're interested in classic horror or seeing some of the greats at work, it's definitely worth a look. Don't expect to be overly terrified though, but the stories are still entertaining for an hour and a half. Next up is Black Death. It's from 2010. It's starring Eddie Redmayne, Sean Bean and Carice Van Houten. It's showing on Prime. So this was set during the outbreak of the bubonic plague in England. A young monk, Osmond, played by Eddie Redmayne, he's given the task of learning the truth about reports of people being brought back to life in a small village. There's sort of threats of a necromancer looming. This is an interesting medieval horror. It takes sort of fundamentalist religious belief and collides it with non-belief. Shades of the Inquisition, when religious knights are dispatched to slay anyone they judge as being agents of darkness. And of course it comes down to their personal belief rather than any sort of divine assessment of right and wrong. The village appears to be inhabited by dark forces because they have avoided the plague, or so they believe. The plague being either a forceful punishment by God, under some belief, or torment by the devil. Both sides fear each other and neither acquit themselves very well, but the village has been free of the plague until it's brought to the village by one of the knights. So they're not necessarily there to help the people of the village. The belief that the plague is divine retribution is pretty messed up though, and in some ways I think the arguing parallels the stupidity that's been going on between the the anti-vax people and the pro-vax people with the COVID crisis. Ultimately, Osmond falls into his own personal hell through a misunderstanding, and the Knights aren't really there to help anyone. They've got a pretty messed up definition of helping if you bring the plague there purposely. I think the actors do a great job, and once again Sean Bean meets a grisly end. This is, I believe, number 2 in his top 15 movie deaths, and this one he's pulled apart by horses, and he really sells it, including the final "F you," where he's like, "Suck it, I've got the plague, enjoy." I enjoyed this. It has an interesting setting, some quite timely commentary about the evil that people do during a time of plague through panic and stupidity. Especially, I think, in the name of religion, which is very relevant in today's day and age. Definitely worth a watch. Okay, next up is Terra Train. It's from 1980. It stars Ben Johnson, Jamie Lee Curtis, and Derek McKinnon, and it's showing on Prime. So 3 years after a prank goes horribly wrong, the 6 college students that are responsible are targeted by a masked killer at a New Year's Eve party aboard a moving train. I didn't know much about this film going into it, but I thought it would be kind of interesting to see Jamie Lee Curtis in one of her earlier films, and my curiosity was piqued when I saw David Copperfield was in it as a magician. Also Hart Bochner, he's the terrible douchebag Alice from Die Hard is in it as well. And anyway, the train, it's an interesting device. It keeps everyone stuck on board with the killer, much the way a lot of thrillers and sort of mystery detective stories do. But it's essentially Halloween on a train. It's pretty standard slasher stuff, although the killer is out for revenge, not just killing for the sake of it. But what distinguishes, I think, is that you have no idea who the killer is for most of the film. It also uses magic and illusion to conceal the killer, which is an interesting device. For some of the film, it looked like Copperfield might have been the killer, but in an interesting bit of misdirection and originality, the film uses an actual trans actor as the killer, which was extremely progressive for those times. Derek McKinnon is actually on screen in a variety of guises for a lot of the film, but you never really know they're there. So I thought that was actually pretty clever. I don't know whether or not I could go back and watch it again, and now I know who I'm looking for, keep an eye out for them, but it was certainly interesting that the killer isn't sort of telegraphed clearly throughout its run. The film also makes good use of the confined space on the train. It creates a sense of tension, even though it's ostensibly a party atmosphere. And the killer spends some time hiding the bodies, which allows them to get their revenge undetected for quite a while. Jamie Lee Curtis does a pretty good job with what she has to work with, which isn't a whole lot. She's a fairly standard generic heroine, but she has an interesting sequence where she unmasks the killer and then has to fend him off. Unlike the other teen characters, she's probably one of the nicer characters, feeling genuine remorse for what happened to Kenny during the prank earlier. Bochner is obviously working on honing his douchebag character, although he's definitely not as slimy as Alice will be in Die Hard 8 years from now. Overall, it's better than I expected. It had surprisingly more depth than many of the other slasher genre films I have seen, and it's gone on to become a cult favourite. It's worth a look if you're interested in the genre. It's a little bit its own thing. Next up is Inbred. It's from 2011, starring Joe Hartley, Seamus O'Neill, and James Doherty. It's showing on Prime. 4 young offenders are taken by their caretakers to the Yorkshire countryside to do community service, but they're soon terrorised by inbred locals who don't welcome outsiders to their village. Inbred Yorkshire hillbillies prey on outsiders who come to the village, which is not something I expected. I don't know, is this a thing in Yorkshire? Do you have a big problem with inbreeding there? It's surprisingly gory, almost immediately. It's extremely graphic and very sadistic. Scenes of torture including chopping pieces of people to pieces, stamping on someone's head with a Clydesdale horse, and exploding someone using the contents of a septic tank. Shockingly, nobody survives, and I usually expect those that fight back to prevail, but they just can't seem to do it this time. It's almost like they have anti-plot armor on. The plot just conspires to kill them, no matter what they do. And I guess that's an interesting spin on the hillbilly killer genre. But once the killing starts, it's very gory, and it does leave you feeling quite dirty and uncomfortable. The tone of the movie is more comedic though, and it would have been I think absolutely irredeemable if it had been played completely straight. But the comedic vein is still very much in the awkward and uncomfortable, cringe I guess you'd call it, rather than a horror comedy like Shaun of the Dead, which is practically Disney compared to this. I'm not entirely surprised that the North Yorkshire people of Thirsk weren't very happy about this film. It certainly doesn't paint their people in a very pleasant light, and it's certainly a very tricky movie to nail down. For me, this is probably right on the edge of my comfort zone, and clearly it was the same for most critics, holding just 18% on Rotten Tomatoes. Most reviewing it as foul, which I think is a fair call. It's a film for a very specific segment of people. If you're looking for a tense, well-plotted horror/thriller with clever twists, this isn't it. The cleverest thing it does is kill all the victims. It's mostly just a gore fest, and if that's your bag, then it's probably for you, but otherwise maybe give it a miss. Okay, next up is Halloween Kills. It's from 2021, starring Jamie Lee Curtis, Judy Greer, Will Patton. It's showing on Prime. So the surviving victims of Michael Myers, there can't be very many left in town at this point, they form a vigilante group and vow to end his reign of terror after they discover he's still alive. Because, you know, why wouldn't he be at this point? I think it's like 10 films or something. Anyway, these newer Halloween films, while being well made and continuing the story with Jamie Lee Curtis, who's always a joy to see, there just doesn't feel like there's enough new in this. It's all very similar at this point. It's just Michael stalking people like he always does. It's okay. But I must admit, I got a little bored with this one. I'm not sure if it's suffering middle film syndrome in a supposed new trilogy, or if it's just mired in the material now. They've just gone back to it so many times now. There's just really nothing to say anymore, and the pacing kind of feels like it drags a bit too. Michael is still ludicrously unstoppable, so nobody ever really offers any significant opposition to him. He just steamrolls across everything in his path. He just slowly lumbers along in his white Captain Kirk mask, slaughtering everyone that gets in his way. He's briefly perturbed when he loses his mask, but his balding old man head didn't provide any scares. Heck, he doesn't even really react. He just sort of lumbers around till he gets it back again. In many ways, it feels like these new movies are just sort of remakes of the old series, and I don't know, I'd really like to see them shake it up and do something new with it. Otherwise, I think it's time to let Michael rest. If you haven't seen the old series of films, then you know you could probably watch the new ones and you'd be all good with it, but I don't know, it just feels like it's retreading old ground at this point. Time to go make something new. If you're a big fan of Michael Myers, you know, really die hard, then maybe check it out and let me know in the comments what you thought about it. But otherwise, give it a miss. There's nothing really new to say or see here. Okay, finally today is The Bone Snatcher. It's from 2003, starring Scott Bairstow, Rachel Shelley, Warwick Greer, and showing on Prime. So this is about some miners, and after they go disappearing in the Namibian, it's a hard one to say, desert, scientists find their remains and seek to find out what killed them. I didn't know anything about going into it other than it was likely low budget. Heck, it is on Prime after all, the home of low budget films, especially horror. And I remembered often seeing the case for this at the video rental store when I was younger. So I was interested to see what it was about. It always had an interesting looking case. Interestingly, it's kind of an African legend thing with a creature that stalks and kills the people in the desert. And I thought that was interesting. I was in for it. The setting's interesting. The pacing though is pretty slow, especially given that the creature only really sort of occasionally kills, and then it's let down by some pretty shady CG effects. The creature's interesting, and it's a colony of ants that kind of form a monstrous shape, I guess, quasi creature around the human bones that they have left after stripping the victim, or you know, sort of the understructure of what's left of the person. It then staggers off to attack new victims. I think it had some interesting ideas and potential, but sadly not the budget or the necessary polish to really be great. It's unfortunately dull. And when there isn't anything sort of creature related happening, we'll have to spend time with characters that just sort of aren't much fun, really. They're just sort of stereotypes, and they're quite hostile to each other, and they're sort of more interested in being a problem to each other than sort of really fighting off the creature. And you don't ever really sort of feel any sort of genuine sense of paranoia between them either. You know, they kind of imply that, oh, maybe you killed them, but you know, it's not like the Thing where you're like genuinely unsure. And they're just not very likable either, so I'm not sure really if some of it's bad acting though, or it's just the material they had to work with. overall I wouldn't recommend wasting your time on it. It's dull, it's cheap, it's one original idea that isn't very well used or implemented. The scariest thing it has going for it is the DVD cover art, which basically gives away the creature once you know exactly what it is you're looking for. I think, I think the idea would be something that could be interesting to be picked up and maybe redeveloped and done well, but other than that, give it a miss, I think. Okay, so those are my suggestions for this week. I hope they're of some interest to you. As always, please leave any comments below, and do click on the like and subscribe, please. I would appreciate that, and it helps me to, get some new reviews out to you as well. As always, my Twitter link is on screen as well. If you want to tweet at me, I tweet while I'm watching things and sort of do mini reviews and things like that on there. And if you want to just come on and chat about films, feel free. Anyway, I hope you're all well. Enjoy some movies and TV. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. Bye now.